What's up, everybody? My name is Dimitri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and to learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this week's episode is Christopher Painter, a globally recognized leader and expert on cybersecurity who has been at the vanguard of U.S. and international cyber issues for over 30 years. First as a prosecutor of some of the most high-profile cyber cases in the country, and then as a senior official at the Department of Justice, FBI, the National Security Council, and finally, the State Department. He's responsible for having established the Office of the Coordinator of Cyber Issues and served as Senior Director for Cyber Policy in the National Security Council. With the Biden administration reiterating prior warnings that the Russian government is exploring options for conducting cyber attacks against the United States in response to sanctions levied against the Russian economy, I wanted to help bring all of you up to speed on what exactly those warnings are, what steps are being taken to minimize the damage, and what the range of possible responses by the U.S. government will be, depending on the nature and targets of those attacks. My objective in bringing you this conversation is to give you the information that you need in order to best prepare yourself or your business for what might be coming next, so that you remain ahead of the curve as events evolve and as the collateral damage of the war in Ukraine potentially widens. As always, premium subscribers will have access to the second half of today's conversation with Chris, along with the transcript and intelligence report, which are the cliff notes to the Hidden Forces podcast, formatted for easy reading of episode highlights with answers to key questions, quotes from reference material, and links to all relevant information, books, articles, etc., used by me to prepare for this conversation. And with that, I bring you my conversation with President of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise and former top U.S. cyber diplomat, Christopher Painter. So, Chris, we were talking right before we turned on the microphone, and I told you that the obvious reason that I've asked you to come on the podcast today is because of the Biden administration's warnings that it's issued around the possibility of cyber attacks and some warning flags that they're seeing. Before we get into all of that, though, I'd love for you to describe for our listeners what your career in cybersecurity has looked like, what it is that you do, what you're known for, and why you are an appropriate person to speak to about issues like this.
Sure. Well, I've been involved in cybersecurity and cyber crime issues, not committing it, but protecting against it and combating it for about 30 years now. So I started as a federal prosecutor going after big cybercrime cases, hacker and other cases. I moved back to the mothership in Main Justice. I was out in LA as a federal prosecutor, moved to DC and helped run the computer crime and intellectual property section there. Went over to the FBI as a deputy assistant director of their cyber division for a short time before going to the White House, where I was a senior director for cybersecurity policy there, and then became our first cyber diplomat at the State Department for about 6 years. Really one of the first, I think the first one in the world, and there are many others out there. And since leaving the tepid embrace of the federal government, I've been involved in a number of different things, including running a cyber capacity building foundation on a couple of boards, writing about these topics. So I have wide experience and also seen the trends over time in how cyber security and our dependence on all kinds of cyber and network technologies has become greater.
I feel like this is like truly one of the most obscure, difficult to understand areas of defense strategy for like the public to sort of think about. What would you say are some of the most frustrating conversations that you've had with people that reveal just how ignorant, and I count myself in this, by the way, the public is around these issues?
Well, weirdly, it shouldn't be that complex. I mean, that's one of the real problems with this area is that it's seen as this, kind of voodoo technical issue that ordinary people can't understand. And because of that, I think it hasn't received the priority or the attention that it needs. And even when it does, it's mostly people being afraid of some bad giant thing happening that's going to destroy their lives, when the reality is a lot different. And I think that, I think back in conversations, you have some of them. Ones where people don't understand the risks at all and are not doing anything to protect themselves, which is just foolhardy. Two, where people think the way you can respond is simply press a red button, an easy button, and suddenly have a response where you're going against Russia or China or one of the other states are involved with this, or it's some criminal group too. So I think there's just a real lack of understanding. And what's weird to me is that there's lots of complex issues in the world. There's nuclear bombs, there's nuclear weapons, there's nuclear power, there's complex energy and financial issues. And policymakers get that. They understand it. And ordinary people kind of understand that at a base level. But cyber has just been treated too much as magic, I think. And that's been true for senior policymakers in the US and others, and companies too, which is unfortunate because you don't have to be a coder. Just like you don't need to be a nuclear engineer, you don't have to be a coder to understand, if you're a business, the bottom line concern when people are stealing your intellectual property or these ransomware groups are shutting you down, or if you're a government where it poses a real risk to things like critical infrastructure, power, financial systems, transportation. So you don't have to be an engineer or a cybersecurity expert to understand those larger issues. And that's one of the frustrations. I think that's changed. Over the last year especially, I think that's changed, and that's a good development.
One of the insights that it took me some time to make with cyber is that unlike conventional conflict, it's not discrete. So in other words, if I were to invest in missile systems, my investment in missile technology and my ability to deploy those missiles is independent of your ability to do the same to me. In other words, in cyber, it's about exploiting systems that we both rely on oftentimes.
Yeah, but there is some imbalance there because the US and Europe and a lot of our partners are far more dependent on these technologies than, say, Russia is. Now, China, I think, is catching up, and even Russia is catching up. But if you look at some of the main aggressors, nation-state aggressors, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, they're not nearly as dependent on these technologies as we are. It's we often live in a glass house in this sense. The other part of that is what you were talking about is it's what we call an asymmetric threat in the sense that you don't have to build a big army. You don't have to invest lots of money in tanks or missiles or planes. You don't need that much resources at all to have a real dedicated and potentially dangerous and impactful cyber program. And a lot of the countries that don't have the resources to do that can cause real problems for big countries because they can invest the resources in cyber. And then the third part of that is, unlike conventional weapons, there's this issue of attribution. You don't see a launch plume when a cyber attack is launched. You don't know where it's necessarily coming from. Now, I think this attribution issue is really overrated. We can get into that in a few minutes. But it is a difference between that and conventional stuff.
So this actually leads me early to a question I wanted to ask. I might as well pose it now, which is that normally NSA and other agencies that exploit cyber vulnerabilities do so at the expense sometimes of the security of American companies, for example, by not reporting a vulnerability that they discover. In that context, is one of the ways in which the government and the private sector are working differently together around this latest conflict, is one of the ways that they're doing that by actually informing companies about vulnerabilities that they've been sitting on for some time, and we're waiting to possibly exploit, but now the risk calculus has changed, so they're now informing companies ahead of time. Is that one of the differences?
I think that's accelerated during the Ukrainian conflict, but I think it was certainly there before. There's shifting over time. You're right. For a long time, I think you discover a vulnerability that you can use to watch systems from one of your adversaries. Now, if you disclose that, your adversary is going to find out about it too, and they're going to close off their systems or protect their systems. So you have to do this balancing of how important is it for intelligence gathering purposes or maybe your own military purposes versus how important it is to disclose it, as you said, to businesses and others so they can protect themselves. It used to be 10 years ago, the balance was way on the don't disclose it side, watch, see what happens. But that's changed significantly where, I think over a number of years now, and certainly under the Biden administration, the default has been disclose. There's something called a vulnerabilities equity process where they look at them and they have different agencies weigh in, but the default has been to disclose. And then when we're seeing the kind of activity we are now, where there's a heightened risk, where we have a nation state that could launch potentially devastating attacks, I think that ups the game even more, and it's changed the calculus. So the idea is, let people know about these things. Even if it hurts your ability to gather information in the medium term, it's more important for people to protect themselves now.
Yeah, I believe that was something we talked about with Bruce Schneier a number of years ago. Is the acronym for that VEP, for the
Yeah,
vulnerabilities.
the vulnerabilities equities process. Yeah, the
Right.
VEP.
Yeah, I
It's
remember
not the
him
VEP process, it's VEP.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, definitely recommend that for listeners if they're interested. So, one more question in this regard before I bring it back, because I do want to go high level before we dig deep into specifics. Do we have any idea about the extent to which the intelligence that the Biden administration has gathered that's allowed it to run interference on a lot of the Russian plans heading into this crisis and afterwards, how much of that may have come from the exploitation of systems? I mean, like, I don't know if this is the right phrase, but, signals versus human intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, that's the phrase. It's signals intelligence is what NSA often does, and human intelligence is often, what CIA and other intelligence services does. It's human versus signals. And look, we have great capabilities in these areas. It's hard to tell, and they certainly haven't disclosed, where the source of this information comes from. What is really remarkable, however, is the fact that they have made this public so quickly that they've essentially declassified this, which is not an easy process. You have the information, you disclose it, you declassify it. And really, it's had an effect, I think, in taking the wind out of the sails of some of Putin's plans and what he was doing. So I think, yeah, absolutely right, that this is coming from different sources. We'll probably never know what the exact sources are because they don't want to burn those sources. And it makes sense because they want to use those in the future.
So what are the important government agencies that are responsible for sharing information across both the private sector and also across government departments, sub-departments, et cetera, in order to help these entities get ahead of any possible attacks?
Well, first and foremost, it's the Department of Homeland Security and the agency there, CISA, which is essentially the cyber agency that was created a few years ago. And it is on point in dealing with the private sector. They've been putting out a lot of the warnings. They've been putting out warnings recently about things that industry should look for. But it's not just them. The White House plays a big coordinating role. There's a national cyber director in this administration, a guy named Chris Inglis, used to be at NSA and very skilled person. Another person who's Ann Neuberger, who's at the National Security Council. So they have a really strong group in the White House. And then Jen Easterly, who's over at DHS. But DHS works closely with the FBI and DOJ, so they put out joint packages where the FBI and DHS says, here's what we're seeing, here's what we're warning you about, take this seriously. And that makes it, I think, a lot easier for companies and others to understand, okay, this is a real threat. This is not just the everyday thing we see every day. This is something we really need to take seriously. So, but they're not the only ones. There are other agencies that are involved. The Department of Defense is involved, especially for the defense industrial base companies and defense contractors. The Commerce Department is involved. It's really a cross-government enterprise. The State Department is involved in a lot of the foreign issues. This is what we used to call and like to call a whole of government enterprise, because each part of the government has a part of this, but they have to work as a symphony working together. And in that sense, the conductor really is the White House.
And private companies, of course, too. So how does this
absolutely.
ecosystem compare to other similar ecosystems? Is it roughly the same, or are there important differences?
I think there are differences in that cyber still is relatively new. It's something that hasn't been well understood, as I mentioned in the past, that we're still kind of figuring out what the best organization is. The idea of sharing with the private sector is critically important, but that's had fits and starts over the years too, where the private sector, I think, very rightly says, well, share actionable information with us. Share stuff we can use. Don't share stuff that just is not very specific. And the government, on their part, says, well, we need to find out from you, too. What are you seeing? What are the intrusions you're seeing? And until recently, and there's been some recent legislation, there's been no real requirement for most of the industry, even if they're critical infrastructure, the things we really care about, to report those kinds of things. So that sharing between the two sides is important. I do think that's gotten better recently, partly because of Ukraine, partly because of the ransomware endemic that we've seen, too, which has been I think really elevated this issue more than anything else before the Ukraine invasion.
So what specifically in terms of Biden's warning about possible cyber attacks, what do we know about the intelligence? What kind of specific information has been released, et cetera?
Yeah, not much. I mean, it's interesting. I and a lot of other folks have been involved in this were a bit surprised that we didn't see more Russian malicious cyber activity when the Ukraine invasion broke out. Now, we saw some before. We saw some going after, some Russian activity going after some of the Ukrainian websites, going after some critical infrastructure there. It's not clear who did this yet, but there was an attack on a satellite service that also had effects in Germany and Poland, but it was initially against Ukraine. We've certainly seen the Russians even a couple of years ago going after Ukrainian power grid to show that they could, and those things could spread beyond Ukraine as a target. But when the actual conflict began, when the invasion began, we didn't see that. We didn't see either those infrastructure attacks, nor did we see the kind of disinformation attacks that we thought would accompany that physical attack. And look, there could be lots of reasons for that, and we can go into that, but we didn't see that as much. However, I think the problem with that is people started saying, well, people have been talking about these big cyber things that Russia could do. We're not saying them. We can let our guard down. We don't need to worry about them. And if you think about what levers Russia has to respond to things like the sanctions that have been imposed against them, or the other things that the U.S. and EU and other allies have imposed against Russia for their invasion, one of the things they could do are cyber attacks. They can do two things: disinformation, which they did in the 2016 election, or the kind of cyber attacks that go after critical infrastructure. Now, most of the time, Russia is interested in espionage. They just want to steal information and not disrupt. But that could change because of this conflict. And I think, there's been lots of stories about what DHS was seeing, whether they were seeing targeting or probing of various critical infrastructure civilian targets in the U.S. that prompted them to do this. And there's certainly some things in the news that would suggest that. And I think those things together made DHS, not just DHS, but President Biden himself issued a warning, and his cyber advisor at the White House also echoed this is something where, as DHS said, it shields up. Don't be complacent. Do all the things you should have been doing before, what you haven't done yet. Plug the holes that you need to do, and take this seriously because we think this is coming. Even though you haven't seen it yet, we still think this is coming.
What are the types of signals that surveyors look for to give them an early warning? Like, what are those things typically? Because it sounds a lot like the way that the Bush administration used to talk about, quote, chatter. In the early 2000s, they were picking up a lot of chatter.
Yeah, it could be that. It could be, like we said before, it could be intelligence that's leading you to see that. It could be, loose talk among the operators, or some test things they're doing. It could be you're seeing probes, like I mentioned before, that they're probing or scanning systems looking for vulnerabilities so they can get in. Or it could be you discover on a system, some malicious code, some Russian malicious code. Right. Now, you don't know what it's for. It could be there to listen in, to do espionage, or it could be there to do something destructive. But that certainly is something you're going to take very seriously, especially at a point of high conflict like right now. So it'll be a whole variety of things. And that's one of the reasons in cyber you have to have all these different parts of the government and the private sector collaborate, because the private sector is going to see a lot of this too. I mean, the government's not the only one with eyes and ears. The private sector is going to see, especially the cybersecurity companies, are going to see a lot of this. They're going to see what's being targeted. They're going to see through the protective systems they set up what's trending, what kinds of attacks are happening. And that has to really go together to inform this view. But, I don't think this is an idle warning. I think that they are very concerned about this now. Who knows if we'll see this real swell of attack. Maybe Putin and Russia doesn't want to escalate it further, and they think they would if they start hitting the U.S., especially critical infrastructure. But I think the chances are there, and that means we have to take the precautions that we need to take.
So you hit on a number of points that I do want to talk about. We'll stagger them out. One of them obviously has to do with objectives. And what is the fine line that the Kremlin is looking to walk here? But before we get to those, and before we get into what kinds of attacks that people should be concerned about, I wonder, is there any way to sort of guesstimate a timeline for such attacks? And I say that because, obviously, if you're seeing the Russian military build troops up against the border of a particular country, you have a much better idea of how long they can sustain that troop buildup, all that other stuff, and when the attack might come. But if you're talking about discovering a piece of malicious code, you have no idea how long it was there.
Right.
So do we have any way of estimating when such an attack may begin, or when such attacks might begin?
You really don't. I think you have to look at the geopolitical things that are going on and say, when is it going to be in Russia's interest to do this? And how will they do this? You're not going to see, cyber code massed at the border like you do with tanks, for instance. Right. You're just not going to see that. It's like the launch plume thing I said before. But you could also, pick up warnings of chatter, as you said before, between operators of what they might be doing. You can see some test things they might be doing, certainly. But, it's hard to do that early warning, much harder than in the physical world, because these are electronic assets. They don't require a lot to do. Now, I will say one thing. This is one of the misperceptions. you can't really launch a devastating cyber attack unless you've done a lot of pre-planning. As I said before, you just can't press a button. Say, they wanted to take down, for instance, the electrical grid in the U.S., which would be incredibly difficult, and difficult to keep it down for any length of time, too.
And very escalatory, too, I would imagine.
Oh, incredibly escalatory, too. I mean, this is one of the reasons that they likely haven't done this yet. If they do something of that level of seriousness, that, depending on the effects, could be incredibly serious. If their people died, if there's destruction, that certainly could be true. But you need to plan for a long time. You need to be pre-positioned in those systems, or you need to have access to those systems. And that doesn't come, again, by a hacker. It's not like on TV or movies where a hacker gets on the keyboard and he's suddenly in. I'm in. I haven't been in before. I've never seen the system. Now I'm in. And you can launch this attack. So it takes a lot of planning. And that's when I say that when you see code, when you see pre-positioning, and we found this before, there's been Russian code found at a nuclear power plant, now fortunately not in its control systems, but in its business systems. So you think about that and you say, well, is that there for espionage purposes? Well, probably not. Is it there to cause disruption? Well, maybe. Does it mean they're going to use it now? We don't know. That could be that you can flip a switch and do that. So that requires you to really do the kind of protection that these warnings have been talking about. A lot of the intrusions by Russia and other adversaries are on systems which, frankly, haven't been patched with things that are available right now. I mean, they're sort of low-hanging targets. They don't have to use their real good stuff if they get in using the stuff that's not that good. This is ordinary vulnerability. So you raise that bar, and you get rid of at least 80, 85% of it. Then you can focus on the really serious threats and how you repel those.
Right. So that was actually going to be when I said that I was kind of skipping ahead with NSA alerting companies about known vulnerabilities that have not been disclosed. My first question was obviously going to be, what have they done to step up getting companies to go ahead and patch known vulnerabilities?
Yeah. Well, they tried to do that, especially DHS and what's called US CERT, the Computer Emergency Response Team within DHS. They put out lots of warnings. They put out these joint warnings I talked about with FBI. But a lot of the private sector people are deluged with these warnings all the time. There's a lot of information out there. And they get private sector stuff, too, from the cybersecurity companies. So getting companies and other victims to take those, and even government agencies, to do that basic level of patching is not that easy. Part of the reason is it hasn't been mandatory before. For instance, even for critical infrastructure, we saw Colonial Pipelines with the ransomware attack back a number of months ago that had people lining up for gas on the East Coast. There was no federal requirement that they had to patch their systems. Now, they should have patched them, but, to keep some of these actors out. There's no requirement to do that. There's no requirement to report that when they get breached, although that's changing with recent legislation. So we're often in the dark on this. And we've been making the argument for years, look, this is good for you. This is good for all of us if you do this. Now, I have some sympathy for some companies, mom and pop operations, small and medium-sized businesses. They don't have an IT department to do this. Even small government agencies are often behind the curve, but you have to take this seriously because it is becoming, the more dependent we are on these technologies, the more of a threat it's becoming to us and actually maintaining, our economic life, our social life, and our national security.
5 years ago or so, one of the very first episodes we did was on cybersecurity, cyber terrorism. And I could swear I remember some crazy number, like 80% or something, or 70% of hospitals in the US don't have a firewall, or at the time didn't have a firewall and didn't have a single IT person on staff. Is that number generally correct, or am I misremembering?
Well, the problem with that is we don't have good statistics. They're not mandatory for them to do this, and there's not mandatory reporting. We just don't know how good people are on this until they've been breached, until they've been hit. And the reason I think, as bad as this ransomware issue that we've seen is, that there's a silver lining to it, is ransomware, as I think many people know, it's kind of a double extortion. The bad guys, and they're usually criminal groups, but they could be nation state backed as well, will get into your system. They'll do two things. They'll shut it down so you can't use it. They'll encrypt everything on your system so you can't use it. But they'll also extort you for money, and they'll say, we'll give you the keys to unlock your system if you give us money. And then they'll also threaten to leak your information unless you give them money. So they get you coming and going. Because that is something everyone understands, and we had the Colonial Pipelines attack. We had the one on what's called JB meat processing. So your hamburger, your gas, your hamburger, and the Irish healthcare system were all hit within like a 2-week period. That's something people Espionage, the ordinary person on the street or even businesses like, I don't know, I don't really care that much about that. Even if your trade secrets are being taken, you don't see it walking out the door. But when your business is interrupted, that's really in your face. And I think it changed people's attitude to say, well, no, this is a real threat. And it also changed the government's approach to make it a real national security issue. And you saw the Biden administration within the space of even 2 weeks make it into a G7 priority, a NATO priority back earlier this year. And when he met with Putin back then, a priority for that summit. So a silver liner of that really pernicious trend we see of ransomware, which is causing lots and lots of money. I mean, there was a Palo Alto Networks came out with a survey today that said the average, I think, payment was about $500,000 that people are paying, and the numbers are really high. It started to raise awareness. It started getting us more to the point where we need to be, where we need to not think of this as this technical issue, but something that actually impacts all of us.
So what kind of attacks do you think we should be most concerned about right now?
Well, I mean, I do care about the ransomware attacks. I think those are continuing. They haven't really disappeared, and when they're on hospitals during a pandemic or they're against critical infrastructure that can have effects on all of us, that's real bad. Even if they're criminal, I'm concerned about those. I'm concerned about nation states like North Korea, Iran, and others who will do more destructive attacks. I'm also concerned about Chinese theft of intellectual property. I'm concerned about, Russian intelligence gathering as well. But the destructive attacks are the ones that concern me. We haven't seen them in force yet, but I think it's still out there and still possible. The one that we haven't seen as much of that I really am concerned about is what we call an integrity attack. So a friend of mine who's the former president of Estonia, Thomas Ilves, who grew up in New Jersey, by the way, he always was fond of saying, look, I care if someone uses one of these denial of service attacks, they call them, one of these things that takes my web page off, or the Estonian web page is off. This happened to him in 2007, my bank's web page off. So I can't reach my web page. I can't reach my bank for a couple hours. I care about that. I care a lot more if someone gets into my hospital records, breaks in, hacks in, and changes my blood type. So the next time I get a transfusion, I die. Or if someone gets into the stock market and changes it so you can't settle trades or has a financial effect. So those integrity attacks, because they're so escalatory, I think we haven't seen them yet. But that's what worries me in the future, that we're going to see, more destructive attacks like that. Yeah,
the blood type one is a great one. It's one we talked about again on that, at least on that first podcast that we did back in 2017, because it's so simple. It doesn't require much, and the target is so easy. If we assume that there are many hospitals that really haven't invested in IT infrastructure and in cybersecurity, you have a vulnerable target. And a lot of these systems have also been connected to the internet, even though they weren't originally built for that purpose, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, and look, that makes sense, especially when you're talking about hospitals who operate on a worldwide basis. They share information, they share diagnoses, they share scanning results, and they're read in different countries to make it more efficient. Of course, they're going to be connected on the internet, and that creates vulnerabilities. And as you say, some institutions are very good, but some haven't put the resources into making sure their systems are secure. And so that's an issue. I mean, even, not everything is connected to the internet. I mean, I talked recently about potential cyber issues with nuclear command and control, and you'll be happy to know that the nuclear command and control is not on the internet, which is good. So despite other various movies, you can't just simply go in and launch nuclear missiles. But, that's a broader element. Early warning systems, radar early warning systems can be faked or jammed, or there's lots of things that could affect command and control, even for nuclear, that cause concern. So we're in a very connected world. We have to make sure that we're protecting those assets that are really important, that we have resiliency, we have backups, we have ways to double check on things. And there's almost nothing that's connected to the internet that is not vulnerable at some level to a dedicated nation state attacker.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about the command and control vulnerability or lack thereof with John Wolfson on the very last episode on sort of evaluating the risks of nuclear war. My recollection, not from that conversation, because we didn't actually nail this down, but I remember years ago learning this, and maybe you can tell me, because it sounds like you would actually know the answer to this. I remember learning that nuclear command and control systems actually don't even have Windows machines. They have like MS-DOS.
It's true that I don't know that for certain. What I'll say is a lot of industrial control systems, for dams and other things, are running on old proprietary systems. that are often not connected to the internet are so weird. They have these proprietary systems, so it's harder to hack them. But now they're all moving into common systems, which makes them a little more vulnerable. Nuclear command and control, I think they do, as you would hope and expect, they take a lot of effort to try to secure those systems. But, there's been a lot of reports about them potentially being vulnerable. And so that's a concern. Now, I don't think, we talked about cyber attacks before and some of the ones that we might envision that would go after critical infrastructure. I don't think we're going to see a cyber attack, hopefully. There's a lot in the press about cyber war, where it's cyber war, et cetera. Fortunately, we haven't seen the cyber 9/11 or cyber Pearl Harbor. I hate those terms that some people throw around. I don't know that we'll see those either. I think we'll see cyber used in a conventional conflict, including the one we're seeing in the Ukraine. I think we'll see more of that. And I think we'll see cyber used for tactical ends by countries too. If we get to the point where we see that big cyber Armageddon or that real impactful cyber event where people are losing lives, then it's just like a physical attack. It doesn't matter what the vector is. We're going to have the same range of responses we would for a physical event too, if a country did that to us. And so I think that kind of deterrence, the low level deterrence of all the stuff we see every day, the theft, the small destructive things, we haven't seen much of an effect. We haven't really done a good job of pushing back against it, frankly. But that high level of doing something that's really damaging, I think one of the reasons we haven't seen that is people know that if they go to that level, we'll come down on them like a ton of bricks.
So in terms of integrity attacks, is there a role for decentralized database technology or distributed ledgers to sort of provide a level of assurance that no information on the database has been changed?
Sure. I think there's some benefit to that you want to make sure that the integrity is there. And so I think those kind of distributed ledgers can help ensure that. I think there's other aspects you want to do too. You want to make sure you have backups. You want to make sure you're comparing backups. There's a lot of things you can do to try to ensure that integrity. You want to make sure you have the data in the first place. There was a Iranian attack against Saudi Aramco years ago where they basically wiped all these computers that they had and they were just gone. All the data was just gone. So, you need to have the data in the first place to make sure that it's reliable. So I think it's making sure the data is secure, you have it backed up. You're constantly backing it up, not just doing it every 3 weeks or so. Mm-hmm. But I think there is a role for that kind of technology to make sure there haven't been changes, certainly.
So feel free to give more specifics in terms of what you might think some of the likely targets could be. And again, I totally understand that someone in your position speaks with a level of purpose. But my other question is, when we think about the potential for any attacks, one of the questions that springs to mind is who would the intended target be? And when I say who, I mean, is it corporate America? Is it the public? And what would the intention be? How much of it is tactical and how much of it is strategic?
Yeah. So let's start with what we've seen. I told you about the four horsemen, the four big countries that our director of national intelligence every year say are the biggest threats. And it's Russia and China at the high end, most sophisticated, full spectrum actors, and then Iran and North Korea who are catching up. And then you also have, criminal groups, transnational criminal groups. Sometimes they're operating as proxies of the nation states, so there's a blending there. And the motivations have largely been, Iran has done some destructive things, some, things against websites, other stuff. North Korea has done some of that. But it's largely been espionage so far, either theft of intellectual property, which China has really done a lot of, or just information like the big SolarWinds attack was really an espionage event. And everyone can be the target of that. It's not just the government who holds information that's useful to those governments. It is a lot of business, technology, and other businesses, climate change. There's lots of different things which would be of interest to those entities in terms of just espionage. And that does have an effect on a company too, because your trade secrets, your crown jewels, if it's walking out the door, you may not see an effect next year, but 5 years from now, 10 years from now, could be a major deal and it could put you out of business. Now, the more destructive attacks, if things really ramped up, let's say if it was China and something started happening in the South China Sea, or now with Russia, who may feel that they need to do something more to respond to Western sanctions, then, I think there are two things. There are the signaling attacks. They're the ones that they would do just to show they can, and to try to get publicity, and frankly, to try to sow some fear in the population, to say, wow, they can do this, they could take down whatever it is, an electrical grid, financial system, whatever they want to do, that would show that we're vulnerable, and that they would hope that would engender some fear. Now, I think that one benefit of these warnings the White House and DHS gave over the last few days is it kind of gets in front of that. So
they've done such a great job with that. They have done such a great job from the beginning.
Yeah, I've been very impressed. It has been sort of music to my ears in the sense that they are really taking this issue far more seriously than ever before, and they are really getting out in front far better than they have before, and that really makes a difference. And so that prepares people for this. So they're not scared if something happens because they have a plan to try to recover. So they might do something like that. They might, I mean, the problem is, even for a sophisticated actor, one of my former colleagues when I was in the government used to say, a sophisticated country can knock you down, knock your critical infrastructure down, maybe for an hour or so, but they can't put their knee on your chest and hold you down. They can't have it go out for weeks at a time, which is where the real effects would come. Because that takes a lot. That takes not just pre-planning, but persistence and a whole lot of things. So I would think that what we'd see is the kind of things that would be sending a message, signaling, but also cause us a little strife. In the theater of operations in Ukraine where Russia is invading, I'm a little surprised we haven't seen more attacks on command and control systems there to try to make it harder for the Ukrainians to operate. But it turns out, at least from news reports, that the Russians' communication systems aren't working very well, so they have to actually use the Ukrainian ones. So they don't want to knock them out. so there's other things that happen that they ameliorate this. But you could see a range of attacks they would go after that would show that they had the capability and that were vulnerable. And, that's a dangerous game, though, because depending on the seriousness of the attack, that's going to prompt a pretty serious response, even more than what we've seen now.
Yeah, so totally. Again, I do want to talk about that. Before we do, though, you mentioned again this idea that these systems, they can come back online pretty quickly. Clarify something for me, please, because when I studied this years ago, I learned, for example, about industrial control systems and supervisory control and data acquisition systems, both of which supposedly have been compromised by, or it was presumed had been compromised by Russian and Chinese state actors. And I had read, and this actually kind of jives with what I had learned from studying the Stuxnet attack, that it's possible to use software to break hardware, like Stuxnet did with a nuclear reactor in Iran.
With the centrifuges, yeah.
Sure. And so something similar could be done, I'd read, with ICS systems. And in some cases, some of the larger components of the electrical grid would take years, presumably, to rebuild because of the fact that these were constructed through complex trade systems. Now we're in a different world. We're moving towards a different world where we kind of internalize some of these supply chains. But is that generally accurate? What am I missing there?
I mean, there is a worry with these SCADA systems that if they get into them and they want to do something destructive, that you can, destroy a generator, destroy things that
transformer
produce electricity.
Or something.
Right, a transformer. But the way the electrical grid is, and we've seen some vulnerabilities in the electrical grid in Texas during the winter, obviously, so it's not as secure as we want it to be. But the idea is it's supposed to have backups. You can have energy flowing from different parts of the country to make up for energy that's lost in one part. So it could cause hardship, and it could be, hardship that's going to take a while to fix. But I think it's something we can survive still, unless you get something that hits all these things at the same time. And I think that's extraordinarily hard to do.
So, Chris, I'm going to move the second part of our conversation onto the premium feed. Again, there are a number of things that we kind of left open. One is command and control systems. Another is this fine line that the Russian government may be looking to walk, because on the one hand, they want to intimidate us from not getting further involved in the conflict, but at the same time, they don't want to drag us into it by over-escalating. So I'd be curious to also understand, well, one, this one's difficult. What do we know about what they perceive our thresholds to be? And then what are our thresholds, do you think? I mean, both of these things are inexact, and it's obviously we're going to be speculating. Another question I have, to bring it back maybe to the information war component, and this is more of an observation that I'd love to get your opinion on in the second part, is if you think that one of the reasons why this has been so effective for us, why the Biden administration has been so effective in this sort of running interference, is because we lean into our strengths by being open, by being transparent, by sharing information. That's something that we can do as Western liberal democracies that a country like Russia or China are going to have a harder time doing. That's something else I'd love to explore with you as well as best practices, things that people can do as well as companies can do to get ahead of this and future situations. Because one of the other things I also wondered about, and then I'll stop talking and we'll move it into the second part, is after the end of the Second World War, the American political economy went into a state of more or less permanent militarization. Do you imagine that we are going to, coming out of this crisis, God willing, we get out of it in a not too bad state, is it going to be kind of shields up going forward in general for companies? Is every company and is the government, are they all going to be much more vigilant? Is their risk to reward calculus going to lean much more towards reducing risk and stuff like that? Those are just some of my questions, Chris. For anyone new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second half of today's conversation with Chris, as well as the episode transcripts and intelligence reports, head over to hiddenforces.io and check out our episode library, where you can also become a premium subscriber today. Chris, stick around. We're going to move the second part of our conversation onto the premium feed.
Absolutely.
For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to full episodes, transcripts, and intelligence reports, which include additional notes, resources, links, and other material that will help you get the most out of each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website at hiddenforces.io. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.